Okay, well, it's a real pleasure to be here at this Migration Matters kickoff, mainly because, well, to start with a confession, I'm not really a migration scholar, so it's great to be here really as a learning experience for me, and I really loved the first presentation. It's so interesting to hear how these kind of intersections happen between the state and workers' rights. But for me, my entry into this field has really been through, as a business school professor, looking at how business practices affect labour rights and employee rights in general. And in particular, in this case, in the context of forced labour and modern slavery practices. So I'm going to talk briefly about a project that I've been involved in over the past couple of years, which has brought me into contact with this research around modern slavery, but really looking at it from a business angle. So trying to understand how a practice like modern slavery makes sense from a business perspective. Now, in some ways, that can be, it's a simple answer, right? It saves money. That would be our typical way of thinking about it. If you force people into work, you're not paying them anything, it's going to save you money. But it's a lot more complicated than that, and it's been quite a revelation to me, really, looking at these practices over the last couple of years to really discover really what's driving organizations to engage in these sorts of practices when, as we all know, practices such as slavery have been outlawed for at least a century, that it's illegitimate, unethical pretty much everywhere. It's enforced in most countries, so why would companies, organizations, individuals even think about doing this? And my core discipline, I'm a business ethics professor, and typically we look at these questions from the point of view of ethics. Is it right or wrong? Is it good or bad? I've never really looked at this as a kind of ethics project as such. I mean, I think we already know that the ethics of slavery are pretty clear, right? We've decided that many years ago. But what's interesting is, okay, if we decide that something is ethically inappropriate, why does it still persist? And I think that's where it becomes useful to look at this from a business perspective. So questions of migration do intersect with these questions around modern slavery, and I'll try and pick out some of the places where that happens. But I'm also very interested in continuing this discussion with you real experts on migration about where these things happen. Most of our thoughts about slavery are rooted in the past. Here's just a couple of recent movies on slavery. 12 Years a Slave, which got lots of Oscar nominations recently. The previous year, Django Unchained. We think about slavery constantly in the culture that we're in, but we always think about it as a feature of the past. This came into the experience of modern slavery came into very acute focus last year. This was in the UK in November last year, where the case of domestic workers being held in servitude for more than 2 decades got announced after a police investigation, presented by the newspapers as the worst case of modern-day slavery ever uncovered in Britain. This is the police inspector who was investigating the case, Kevin Highland. But really this makes us think about, so what's happening in our current environment where we might think about issues of slavery. This is a poster from the government of Canada talking about people for sale in Canada, the question of human trafficking. And very much these are combined debates around trafficking, modern slavery, through to forced labour and other types of exploitation. My work has been focused in particular on the act of forced labour and modern slavery. So if trafficking is about the movement of people into slavery, often through various forms of migration, the research I'm going to talk about is very much about, well, what happens when they're there? What about the exploitation that happens once you are in place? Just some quick examples to illustrate the wide range of where these practices might take place. Another one that came out last year was about migrant workers in construction sites in Qatar, helping to build World Cup sites for the World Cup, several years away still now, particularly workers from Bangladesh and other parts of South Asia. The top picture here is a child worker in the cocoa fields of the Ivory Coast, where there's been many instances found of slave labour amongst children, young adults in cocoa farming, often involved with farming that may eventually enter into the supply chains of products that we consume in the West. This was a case of brick kiln workers, so workers involved in making bricks in China, in Shaanxi province, who were rescued a few years ago after a number of raids by the Chinese authorities, rescuing hundreds of workers who were forced into labour on these charcoal-making camps, brick-making camps. Often they were had mental health problems, alcohol homeless problems, and were forced into work, sometimes eating just one steam bun a day, often victims of violence and abuse of various sorts. Here's the guy showing some of the sores on his arms. When we talk about modern slavery, we're obviously talking about something that's quite different from our slavery of the past. We're often not talking about people that are in chains or shackles. We're often not talking about documented slavery in the same way. There will often not be ownership documents attached to people. But we're talking about a practice that shares many of the same characteristics. And although there is much debate over whether this is the right term, whether we should be using it, it has become very much a common term, often for rhetorical purposes, but also in international law. The terminology that is most frequently used comes from the League of Nations Declaration on Modern Slavery, where they talk about it being the exercise of any or all of the powers attaching to the right of ownership, with the idea being that if you can act towards someone as if you own them, that is an instance of modern slavery. Okay, so if you have something that's like the rights of ownership and you're acting upon it, for example, through intimidation, force, forcing people to work, not allowing them to leave, all those sorts of things, then it can be regarded as a potential act of modern slavery. There are all kinds of ways of defining this that try and get beneath, so what does it actually mean to exercise those rights, which we can talk about perhaps in the discussion, but that's the general kind of framing that is used. This is actually a worker in a charcoal camp in Brazil, where again there's been many instances documented of slavery, where workers are taken off to work in these camps. These are some of the kilns you can see here where the charcoal is made. So much of my previous work in this area had really been looking at, well, what are the explanations for why slavery might persist? And then last year I got involved in a project funded by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation in the UK, looking at forced labour in the UK and trying to explain how slavery-like practices may become manifest even in developed countries such as the UK. But in particular, what are the business drivers? They wanted to understand, how do we understand the business models for modern slavery? I've got a few copies of the summary report here, which I'll leave at the front. If anybody wants to take them, all this stuff is available on the web, and I'll give you the addresses at the end. So we put together a team, myself, a law professor, a criminologist, and a political scientist, a really interesting interdisciplinary team to try and investigate these business models. And we came up with a kind of framework that we think is helpful in explaining the business of modern slavery. This is the basic model. I'm from business school. Everything pretty much ends up in 4 boxes in our world. These are not supposed to be quite discrete boxes. These are 2 continua. But we think this helps to explain the different types of way in which employers will make money from forced labour. So the first thing we have to do is think about who are the types of people that are perpetrating forced labour. And that's in the vertical axis here. So our typical way of thinking about slavery is, well, it's happening on a plantation or in one of these charcoal production facilities where it's a producer. It's the farmer, it's the factory owner, it's the construction site owner that's perpetrating the slavery. What we found, particularly in the UK context, was very often it's not only producers who are involved in these practices, but also a labour market intermediary. This might be someone that is a labour agency, some kind of an agent operating on behalf of recruiting and paying workers of various sorts. So the first thing we need to do is distinguish these 2 types of actors, because they operate in quite different ways, they make their money in very different ways, but they also create value and are regulated in different ways as well. So we have to have a very clear distinction about who is perpetrating slavery. Just to give you a sense of this, we also started to put together some of these diagrams to try and work through what were the supply chains involved. So if you think about a supply chain, we think about products, P1, P2, P3, P4 across the top there, moving through different processes of production. Okay, it's fairly common to think about it, a product going through a supply chain. Okay, gets taken out of the ground somewhere, somebody does something else to it, it ends up in a factory, then it gets sold on to somebody else, and then sold on to somebody else. What we also need to think about, though, is the labour supply chain. We have two intersecting types of supply chains here. Okay, so labour doesn't just appear miraculously for an employer. It goes through some kind of chain. Sometimes a chain of custody, sometimes just a chain of actors of different sorts. And so our forced labour chain, the black one here, we're saying is a different chain that may go into, here P3 would be the kind of producer that's involved in actually the exploitation. If we think about an intermediary conducting forced labour, we might think about the supply chain here intersecting earlier. So L1 is a labour provider into the producer. Okay, so the producer knows nothing about what's happening in this supply of labour. They just know who's supplying them directly. And the more we did research in this area, the more we got very complicated figures coming up here with multiple levels of intermediaries, often involved in subcontracting into other intermediaries. So this would start branching off into other areas, and we got these very, very sophisticated, very complicated models in the end. But just to give you a very simple understanding, there's two types of perpetrators, producers, intermediaries, and that these intermediaries can get very complicated types of models involved there. So that's the first way that we need to think about it. The second way is, well, how do you actually make money out of forced labour? And the obvious way, of course, is that it's about cost minimization. But there's also another way, and that's about revenue generation. But let's start with cost minimization, because even that is more sophisticated than we expected. The typical way that something like slavery, forced labour, or any of these kind of extreme exploitation might be thought of is it's going to save you money in some way. One of the industries we looked at three industries in the UK. We looked at farming, construction, and the growing of cannabis. And the cannabis industry is a curious one in the UK. It's primarily dominated by Vietnamese criminal gangs. About 80% of UK cannabis is grown by Vietnamese criminal gangs. Now, there have been some instances of them using trafficked workers from overseas, sometimes from their home countries, sometimes via Europe and other places, to be used in their grow-ops. And we started looking at this to think, well, why would you bring workers from overseas to do this? We looked at lots of research around the drugs industry, and all of it said it was very easy to find low-cost workers. We looked at research from Chicago, which looked at hard drugs, and discovered that you could pay peanuts to workers to get them involved in the drug trade, because there's lots of young people who are interested in becoming involved in the drugs industry, so it gives them an opportunity to make lots of money in the future. Realistically, they're not going to make their way up the corporate ladder, but it gives them an opportunity. We also looked at research conducted in Canada around cannabis growing and other drugs industries, and again found that it was very easy to get young people involved in the drugs industry for almost no pay. It really isn't difficult. So it didn't seem to us very sensible to go through the whole process of trafficking people in from Vietnam when you could just pick up some local workers to work in the factories, in the crops rather. But the more we started to explore some of the court cases around this, we discovered that really what was happening was this was a process for the growers of trying to minimize their risk. They brought in people from Vietnam because these were often people that were very much in a precarious situation. So whether they volunteered to come over or not, once over, they could be locked in, so they would never move around the local community, they wouldn't likely to be investigated, they couldn't speak English. The whole chance of them being caught were less because they didn't move around, and if they were caught, there was less chance of them actually reporting on the criminal gangs because they couldn't speak English. They were typically children or looked like they were children, and so would go through a different criminal justice route to if they were adults. So there are all kinds of reasons why this helped provide an extra sheen of protection for the criminal gangs. So it wasn't just about reducing their labour costs, but about reducing their risks in terms of doing business. Just quickly about revenue generation. When we see a field of agricultural workers like this, we typically think, well, these people are workers, right? But if you operate in a forced labour enterprise, you may look at these people and say, consumers. And we saw lots and lots of instances, particularly where forced labour was perpetrated by an intermediary of some sort, an agency, that often they wouldn't even be working the people very hard. Sometimes they would work them hardly at all. And in fact, what they would typically do is try and get a lot of workers under their control and then force them to pay for various services, which might be housing, it might be food, transport, visa services of various sorts, which they would then overcharge them for because they had a monopoly supply relationship with them. They had no option to go for any other suppliers of housing or anything else. So they could overcharge them and then just add them to the debt they already had from getting into the country. And so in various ways then they could just escalate their debt very quickly, which put them into even further control of their perpetrators. So rather than seeing these workers as people that you're going to put to work and work them to death, they actually typically would not give them enough work, which made them even more vulnerable, prevented them from leaving, and then used them as ways to generate money. So that's the basic model. Thinking about these two dimensions, who's employing them, that has a big impact on how they're regulated, and then also how they're actually generating money from this, through revenue generation or cost minimization. And you can see in these examples how migration plays a critical role. First off, because migration here, if we think about something like cost minimization, you have to be bringing people in from somewhere else to be generating those kind of advantages to make it worth your while. And then with the revenue generation, it's crucial that you can get people into your control in the first place, which is typically through some kind of migration, forced or voluntary, and then getting people into the country and then under your control. So that's the basic model and how it might fit. A few conclusions. First off, that obviously, despite being abolished, slavery can flourish, or various forms of things that look much like slavery can flourish if it makes rational business sense to do so. And so really we need to understand this business of slavery. We also need to understand clearly what happens in terms of regulation, enforcement, and those sorts of things. But we also have to understand the business dynamics if we're going to really eradicate these forms of exploitation. We have to understand how the business works. So the role of migration, and the important thing to note here is it's not always forced migration that leads to forms of exploitation of this kind. Sometimes people willingly will be moving from different countries or different parts of countries, but often will be duped into then situations through indebtedness and other things that make them liable to exploitation. And so the policy and practice interventions we need to make, whether those are hard policy or soft policy around self-regulation, business codes of conduct, those sorts of things, they really have to understand these different conditions that lead to people being vulnerable to slavery, but also to the practices that businesses use to exploit them. So I'll leave it there, and I look forward to our conversation later. Thank you. One more point. Here, if you want to know, are the where you can find out some more information, an academic paper, the more practitioner report, and then finally, for the very light reading, just a nice newspaper article.